Hello out there. Thanks for joining us on Old Bodies Outside. This is Dr. Brian Peterson, and today on the show I have Dr. Ashley D'Antonio, who is a professor at Oregon State University, and she researches recreation ecology, which is a field of research that examines and tries to manage the environmental consequences of nature-based recreation. And most of her research takes place in parks and protected areas such as national parks and national forests. And I am really excited to have Ashley here. I don't think she probably realizes how much of a great inspiration she has been to my career. I even have on my computer a folder of all her published manuscripts that I love to keep up to speed with and reference in my research. So she's always served as a really, really great inspiration for me in generating ideas and whatnot. And in addition to Ashley being a wonderful teacher at Oregon State University, a wonderful scientist, she also serves on the George Wright Society. And the George Wright Society, coincidentally, is sponsoring today's episode. So let me tell you a little bit about them. And they are a nonprofit that champions parks, protected and conserved areas, and other kinds of place-based conservation. The George Wright Society honors George Melendez Wright, a Hispanic conservation pioneer and the first scientist for the National Park Service. So pretty cool. You can check out more information on the George Wright Society at georgewrightsociety.org. And the spelling for Wright is W-R-I-G-H-T. Okay, well, let's get into today. So Ashley, great to see you. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thank you so much for those kind words about my research. I really appreciate it. And your work is often frequently cited by me in my lab as well. So I'm really excited to chat with you about what I've been working on and the type of research that we do in my recreation ecology lab.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, I was discussing there on your introduction, just kind of gave a brief definition of what recreation ecology is. And I think one of the first things that maybe we should discuss is the environmental consequences of nature-based recreation. I think that the broad, in the research world, we have a lot of these esoteric jargon terms such as recreation ecology. And I know that you and I have talked before, and we know that a lot of scientists don't even know what recreation ecology is. And it's something that is extremely valuable. And maybe we can start that conversation with just kind of hearing about what is meant by the environmental consequences of nature-based recreation.
Yeah, that's a great question and a really great place to start. So sometimes people think that outdoor recreation in parks and protected areas is essentially impact free, so that by being in these places, we are kind of not having any impact on the environment around us if we're not doing maybe consumptive activities like hunting and fishing, which are also totally okay. But even activities like hiking or mountain biking can have impacts to the environment. And these can be impacts to things like soil or vegetation. So if you're biking or hiking on a trail, your shoes, the tire tread can cause impacts to vegetation and soil. We can also have impacts to wildlife. So maybe if you think about maybe you've been out hiking and all of a sudden a bird flushes out of the bushes or wildlife runs away, that is causing a disturbance to those wildlife species. So we can have impacts to wildlife or impacts to other components of the ecosystem like water. So for example, one of the students in my lab is actually looking at how improperly disposed of human waste, so when we poop in the woods and don't dispose of it properly, that can result in E. coli getting into soils and waters, and that's a type of disturbance as well. So it's basically just understanding the interactions between outdoor recreation and various aspects of the environment, soil, vegetation, water, wildlife, and how we might be causing disturbances to those by being in these natural and protected areas.
Yeah, that was a great explanation. You got me thinking about the water aspect. Not that I'm going to get into that vein there, but overall, I was maybe a couple summers ago asked to do some research with some scientists out. I forget what university they're at. George Mason. There you go. George Mason University. And they were looking at how sunscreen rinses off of people's bodies when they go into a lake or ocean. And then what effects does that have on the wildlife that's living in those lakes or ocean and whatnot. The research I tried to be a part of it ended up not coming through, but I thought it was such a great thing to research and something that probably hasn't been researched a bunch. And they were also not just looking at sunscreen generally, but looking at these different, the different ingredients in sunscreen and how those different ingredients interact with these different places. And so Similar to Ashley, I also do a lot of research in national parks and our national forests. And today, did you see on email, Ashley, that we got accepted into our panel presentation at a conference? So Ashley and I will be kind of presenting within a panel, probably back to back sequentially. I think we each have 2 or 3 from our labs that will be presenting. So at that conference, Ashley, what are you going to be presenting about?
Yeah, I'm super excited for that conference too. With the pandemic, it's been a while since we've been in person to present research, so that'll be really exciting. I have 3 presentations from my research lab, and one of the things that's interesting about them maybe is they're kind of occurring at different scales. So we can think about the scale of an entire park or protected area, so all the way out to the boundaries, the map you might pull up when you're planning your trip. So one of the studies that we'll be presenting on is a project with myself and a former postdoc, Dr. Evan Bredenway. We were funded by the National Park Foundation, which is the official nonprofit of the National Park Service. They had these National Park Foundation Science Fellowships that started in 2019, 2020. And we'll be presenting some work from that where we looked at how roads and trails in parks and protected areas, specifically Rocky Mountain National Park and Yellowstone National Park, these were our 2 park partners, how the layout of those roads and trails may be influencing things like habitat fragmentation or habitat connectivity. So habitat, like how much habitat there is, how connected it is, how easy it is for wildlife to move between them is really important for conservation goals and for protecting biodiversity. So this project was to look at how does the pattern in roads and trails potentially influence those factors? Again, that habitat connectivity and habitat fragmentation, with the idea that, the park's not necessarily going to go and move a whole road, but by looking at where there might be some interactions of interest, where we have maybe patches of habitat that are very important or very large, that could help the park best use resources for monitoring and further research. So basically this project, again, was very GIS heavy. We were looking at, again, spatially where roads and trails are, with the idea that our findings could help inform future studies or inform park monitoring. So that's kind of my biggest scale project, right? We were looking at every road and trail in Rocky and every road and trail in Yellowstone for that project. So that one's really fun. That's one I've been really excited about. But that is one of the 3 that I'll be presenting on with Evan.
Yeah, well, I haven't actually thought too much about, when people are designing trails. So say if we were to have a blank canvas for a park and we're like, okay, let's put some trails and whatnot. I think some of those considerations actually aren't always considered. Like, it's just like, hey, let's put a trail into a spot that everyone's going to love, but without thinking about, maybe breaking it down into segments every quarter mile or something. And how would that affect wildlife? Could that possibly fragment wildlife, or could that actually, push wildlife out to other areas, and then they're, having to compete in an area that they're not familiar with. So that sounds like it's really useful information. And you mentioned GIS, and that's something that I know we both do a bunch. And GIS, for those of you that don't know out there, stands for Geographic Information Systems. And it's a cool way to visualize data. And it's a great tool in which you can overlay layers. And usually the explanation that I give that resonates the most with people that do not use GIS is I talk about Google Maps. And so with Google Maps, when you look at it, you have a layer that's your street layer. So you see roads and highways and freeways. And then you see these colors, green for where there's no traffic, and orange where there's, getting to be some heavy traffic, and then red where there's real heavy traffic. Well, right there, you have 2 layers of geographic information. You have the roads layer, and then where there's traffic and where there's not traffic. So the ability to overlay those layers and see where things intersect is what GIS is fantastic at, and we use it all the time in our research. So Ashley, now that I was talking about GIS a little bit, what types of tools do you use with your research? You mentioned GIS. I know you have you do a lot of surveys to understand, what people are thinking, their perspectives, their motivations. And so how do you end up, say you use GPSs to see where people go, you use surveys to understand their motivations, their preferences, their perspectives. How do you bring all that together to have a really robust research examination?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And just to kind of maybe a little bit of a tangent on that, one of the reasons I think that a lot of the work in my research lab uses GIS and GPS is because it's really a nice way to combine some of the social aspects of outdoor recreation, where people go, their motivations we can get from surveys, with some of the ecological data that's often collected. And so a lot of ecological data is already spatially based, if you will, right? We can see where the habitat is. We sometimes even know where wildlife are moving from GPS collars they may wear. And so the ecological data that I'm really interested in looking at already is spatial. So if then we can collect information on our outdoor recreationists, on our visitors to our parks and protected areas in the same geospatial manner, then we can overlay those in some really interesting ways and do some interesting analysis. So,
yeah.
Oh yeah, go
continue
ahead.
On. Yeah, sorry about that. I took a breath there. No, continue on.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we try and do in my lab is to really combine all these things in informative ways. And so some of the research that we do is really pairing survey methods. So asking visitors about their experience, asking visitors of why they're in a particular park or protected area, and then connecting it to a GPS track that they have, either from a GPS unit that they've carried, or some work not in my lab is looking at more using like mobile device data from cell phones and others, but connecting some things about the person's experience that they can tell us about, the why of their visit, and connecting it about the where, like where they went and how they behaved. And so we can look at if there's differences in motivations for where people went or the experiences they had. So as like a quick concrete example, I worked on a project with colleagues at Penn State and Utah State and Grand Teton National Park a few years ago. And one of the motivations for coming to our study site, Stringenly Lake, was that visitors were seeking a sense of escape. So like escape from everyday life, solitude, relaxation. That was kind of the types of responses we were hearing from visitors. But we found that almost a quarter of visitors did not find that escape. They said, I sought this thing out. I wanted to find escape. And at the end of my visit, I didn't achieve that. We were able to look at their GPS tracks and see where those visitors who did not find that sense of relaxation went, to see if there was some difference in spatial behaviors. And we found that those folks, maybe not surprisingly, stayed in kind of the busiest places of the lake. They didn't go very far into the trail system, and so they couldn't find what they were looking for. Whereas visitors who said they wanted escape and found it actually traveled further into the trail system. So they kind of got away from those kind of busier locations and were able to achieve the motivation they came from. So that's one example of how we can combine that survey data with the GPS data in a way that's meaningful for managers. They can use that information to maybe communicate to visitors like, hey, if you want this sense of solitude, you might need to go a little further, which can then have ecological implications. So that's a whole nother side to that story. Yeah. But that's one, I think, interesting way of combining these social science data methods that are aspatial, right? We don't have an X and Y coordinate from surveys always, and connect it to something in space.
Yeah, and I think it's really powerful and really meaningful and very useful by managers, as you mentioned. And the research that Ashley and I do is heavily applied science, which means we're trying to produce something that's very pragmatic and useful, typically for managers of these parks and protected areas. And I just wanted to piggyback on your explanation there, Ashley, because it was really wonderful. And it's what I do for research too. Surveys and GPS data loggers analyze this using GIS software, typically ArcGIS Pro. But one of the things I think is that I'm always trying to keep in my mind is that people's experiences happen at a specific location at a specific time. So at a location and a specific time, you have an experience. So one experience might be different over here at this time. An experience might be different over here at this time, or an experience might be different here at a different time. And it's really important to kind of see how those nuances work sometimes too. And I always really get fascinated by seeing those nuances. And so I'm really excited. I have a project that I'm working on right now, and I am going to be, for the second time, implementing public participatory GIS. And I'm going to be using a software called MapShanair, where people can circle different areas, and then I can learn about their motivations or preferences or perspectives when they circle those areas. And so I'm really excited to kind of be able to break down those nuances.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Like I said, oftentimes surveys are just capturing like a whole visit, and you're right. Like different things happen in different places within a visit. And so that PPGIS, public participatory GIS, is a really great way to get at some of that. So I'm excited to hear what you find.
Yeah, we'll see. And, I'm kind of curious about how I don't know how the data is going to look and how comparable it's going to be between different, if I'm breaking it down into different places and times and whatnot. and to see if I can gain a lot of statistical depth with it, but we will see. So you mentioned Grand Teton National Park, and I read somewhere when I was prepping for today's podcast is that your favorite national park?
That is one of my favorites. It's it's a tie. It's a tie between, depending upon the day, I might give a different answer. It's a tie between Grand Teton and Rocky Mountain National Park. Those are definitely my top two for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gosh, I think one that I really love a lot is Kings Canyon Sequoia National Park. I love that one a lot. And I think I'm from California, and that one I've done a lot of backpacking in, and I've had really great positive experiences. I'm a person that loves some solitude and escape as well. And Kings Canyon National Park, it has a lot, when you get into the backcountry has a lot of similarities to Yosemite National Park, but the parks are set up a little bit differently. Yosemite National Park has a little bit more roads that you can access stuff. You don't have to do as far of a hike in, where Kings Canyon National Park, you have to work pretty hard to get to some locations. I enjoy that because then I get more solitude and escape.
I'll have to add that to my list. I have to admit, I've not been to Kings Canyon yet, even though it's not too far from me now in Oregon. That might have to rise to my list, my short list of places to visit in the next little bit.
Yeah. Well, this summer I'm hoping to go backpacking in the northern part of Yosemite National Park. So I've spent some time. I love Yosemite National Park too. I was honestly going to list that and Kings Canyon as my top two. And I tailed off on the Yosemite part, but I did a 10-night backpacking trip there in the summer of 2020 and really loved it. And I just went. I did a loop out of Tuolumne Meadows.
Oh, nice.
And this upcoming summer, I'm hoping, I don't have it mapped out yet, but I'm hoping to start north outside of the park boundary in the Hoover Wilderness, and then come south and just kind of follow the northern boundary from the west to the east, and then exit out and do a loop like that. And I don't know if it'll be 10 nights, probably more like 6 or 7 nights, but definitely check out Kings Canyon National Park when you can.
Yeah. I was in Yosemite actually last September. I got to go backpacking with one of my grad students. We were working on another collaborative project. I'm very collaborative in my research, so I always have partners I'm working with. We were working with other colleagues at Penn State, and Jeremy Wimpy, who's also a recreation ecologist, and he's a consultant. And so we were surveying backpackers actually. And so it was just a one night, but a grad student and I got to do a one night backpack to kind of see how the survey was administered. And we actually piloted and we're testing out, you mentioned experiential surveys and how experiences change over trips, using cell phone based apps to survey visitors in the backcountry night overnight on their backpacking
Interesting.
trips. So we had a more traditional survey approach where people carried travel diaries with them and they marked every night where they camped and answered some survey questions. But we also, as kind of another way to get the same data, we had folks opt in to downloading an app, and every night they would be pinged with survey questions when they got to their campsite. And every morning they'd be pinged with survey questions again for the next morning. So we could look at folks' experiences in the wilderness of Yosemite. Measure some of these typical wilderness characteristics, like things that you're seeking, right? Solitude, minimizing impacts, minimizing presence of other humans. So anyways, that was really interesting. And the project was super cool, but it was also really fun to get to go on a backpacking trip with one of my grad students I've known for quite a while as part of that project. It's a perk of the research, right? So
that's exactly what I was just going to say. It was like, I love our field because we get to, do fun research and also go to fun places and get to have a little bit of fun too, when it happens. But I love your research design there with how does that app work? So if they're in the backcountry, there's probably not cell phone service, but that app is still pinging them. How's that working?
Yeah, so I was not as involved in the app development, but as long it is like timing based. So as long as your cell phone still has the internal clock, so it assumes you're going to get to your campsite at a certain time, and so the app will ping you at a time versus like a stopping location. And we did not collect. And this was for battery purposes. We didn't collect. With GPS tracks, we get everywhere someone went, like along a trail and where they camped. So we only took X and Y coordinates of where folks were camping for that individual night. And then, so that was just kind of a one ping to figure out the location within that app. And the GPS in your phone is still working even when you don't have cell phone coverage. So that we were able to get the data that way. And then everything else you just downloaded ahead of heading into the backcountry. So if folks didn't download the app and didn't start to participate in the survey with the pre-trip questions, then they might not be able to have the rest of that trip. So that was, again, why we wanted to kind of test this method out to see like, okay, how many people downloaded the app? How many answered our questions ahead of their trip? Did they continue night after night to respond to these survey questions on their phone? And again, it was timing based. So we assume most folks were in their camp around 6 p.m. probably. And so they'd get a little ping and be like, are you camping? And if you said no, it'd ping you again in like another hour. And then again at 6 a.m. the next morning, the app would ping you again with the new questions for the next day. And so it was all like built into the app and based on time of the day. So that's as much as the deep dive into the app development that I got.
That you know,
it seemed to work pretty well. Definitely we had, and this happens with paper surveys, like folks maybe participated for a night or two and then like didn't finish the survey. But I think overall it was fairly successful. And we did have a question, I haven't looked at these results, about the experience of using technology in a wilderness setting, in a backpacking setting, to see if that, you know, you might be backpacking in Yosemite because you're not going to get notifications on your phone. And then in the morning, you're getting this notification to do the survey. So we also want to be sensitive to the experience of the visitor and what it's like to engage with an app and with your phone when you're in a backpacking trip from that way. So I still haven't looked at that data. We're still working on analyzing data from that project. But it was part of a larger effort to help Yosemite with some of their wilderness permits and wilderness management. Yeah,
that's great. I've been doing a little bit of research there in Yosemite with a colleague out of UC Merced, and we were supposed to go out there this past summer in earlier mid-June, and a fire broke out and we ended up not going, which is a bummer because it's always fun to go in the field for our research.
Yeah.
So that got canceled, and I don't know if we're going to be able to reschedule that or not. But I want to ask you a question about why is it that researchers prefer to administer a survey when things are happening, maybe right after the experience happened, versus, hey, why don't you just fill out a survey when you're done with your backpacking trip?
Yeah, that's a great question. And mostly that's due with how terrible human memory is or like recall bias. So there's been other studies in psychology and other fields of research that show that we actually have pretty bad like memories for specifics. And sometimes we might have some recall bias where something, a particularly bad experience, like stumbling upon a pile of human waste that's unburied, might stick out in your mind more than like some of the good experiences that you had around, experiencing solitude or seeing a really cool landscape or, having a great conversation with your backpacking buddy. So the closer to the experience that we can survey people or gather information about their experience, the more accurate we feel like the feedback we get from visitors is, just because human memory is not that great. Like I'll probably an hour from now forget like half this conversation that we had. So if you ask me like, oh, where exactly did you hike or where exactly did you stay? Or, how many people did you see at your campsite on night 3 of your backpacking trip? I might not be able to remember that like 2 days later. So the closer to the experience we can get the data, the more accurate we feel like that information is.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. And I think that's how my mind works too. It doesn't work so well, but it does remember the highlights of things, whether they're positive or negative, and then like it might put an overemphasis on that memory than when I experienced it in the moment. So it is important to do that, which is another fantastic. And that was a great example too, of just synthesizing that GPS using a cell phone app to survey. So that was cool. How long did it take I've never developed an app for research. I typically just buy software off the internet and budget it in as a line item. How did you get that developed?
Yeah, that was really Jeremy Wimpy who was leading that. Okay. I think there was a group that he worked with out of Bend, I believe, Bend, Oregon, that was interested in developing some app-based stuff for research. And it was very much an iterative process because they're really great at developing apps and do an amazing job, but they're not necessarily experts on survey design. So things like, hey, we don't want like the slider on the survey to be in the middle because we don't know if someone actually like moved the slider to the middle or if it was a default, right? Can we put like a slider on the survey where, you might be if you've taken online surveys before, right? Ask you a question, you might move a little slider from like 1 to 5 or something like that. So talking through some of the survey approaches that we needed in the app to make sure that we were following good survey protocols. There was just kind of an iterative process of learning both directions and like what is possible and not possible in the app development. And then also making sure like we would pilot it and get the data on the back end so we could look at it to make sure that we could analyze the data in the way that we needed, that we could get that, the X and Y coordinates from those campsite nights into GIS and paired with the survey, and everything would look good, so that we were figuring that out early, not when we were done the study and we got the data and we're like, oops, this didn't work the way we wanted. And now this has been a waste of everyone's time. So we did a lot of iterative development, pilot testing to make sure that it would work the way that we hoped it would, and get the data in a way that we could analyze it for this study, and analyze it in ways comparable to the paper survey data that we were also collecting on this study.
Yeah, with that iterative process for making sure the survey is designed effectively using all this background of theory on surveys and whatnot, I think that's something that probably a lot of people that aren't researchers aren't aware of. And one of the best ways that we come to understand and examine people's experiences, and whether that's going to be preferences, attitudes, perspectives, values, motivations, is through surveys. And there's actually a lot of theory behind how to design those questions, put them together, how people are perceiving them. And so it's really important to always be checking those surveys. And that's something that we put a lot of thought into. It's a lot of just small details, a lot of thought into, and how people are going to be using that survey. And is it actually measuring what we want it to measure? That's the really important part.
Yeah.
Well, I think that app sounds really cool. I got to try that out sometime. That seems like a great way to get that survey data right there at the end of the day when the experience, is fresh in the memory. So that's really cool. You mentioned cell phone data earlier, so I've been starting to use that. But the thing with cell phone data is you can't attach a survey to it. You can't have that coupled. And coupling that survey with this location data, whether it's GPS or whatever, is really, really helpful. But I'm using cell phone data to we're going to get a broad understanding of visitation dynamics across 4 national forests in California. And that's starting from the south, adjacent to the Mexico border, is Cleveland National Forest, and then San Bernardino National Forest, Angeles National Forest, and Los Padres National Forest. And we're going to be using cell phone data to understand visitation dynamics. And then and what I mean by that with visitation dynamics is, hey, what does the visitation look like for annual visitation counts, weekday visitation counts, weekend visitation counts, holiday visitation counts? And part of this research is we're going to overlay that. We have a fire ecologist on the project who is going to model potential fire severity. And one of the problems that's going on in these 4 forests is they are having to shut these forests down more and more frequently for wildfire. So they'll have a massive wildfire event and they're like, you know what, we need to shut the whole forest down. It's too dangerous right now. And then also, it's happened a couple times right around Labor Day. These forests are getting shut down for preventative reasons. So you have really extreme red flag conditions. So it's really hot out, really dry, and these areas are so prone to wildfires that they shut them down preventatively. And so the last part of the research is going to really examine how to message to a very diverse socioeconomic population up and down California to stay out of the forest when you don't see smoke, you don't see fire, there's no fire going on, but we need to preventively shut it down. And so that's one of the first steps in that research process is the analysis of cell phone data. And so were you on the project in Orange County that used streetlight data? Okay. So that one, yeah, I love that one. That one was so informative because I helped Dr. Chris Sikowski and Dr. Jess Pfeffer doing some streetlight data analysis out in the Washington, D.C. area. And man, I read that manuscript up and down quite a few times to make sure that we're feeling confident about making the big purchase for getting streetlight data. And so buying mobile phone data is not cheap. It's pretty expensive. They luckily sometimes will give a university discount, but that's another example of your influence on my livelihood as a researcher, very positive influence.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think the cell phone data is very expensive, and I think for the right project and the right question, it can definitely be worth it. I mean, again, as a recreation ecologist, I'm really interested ecological impacts that always happen at like the human scale, like the scale that we're thinking about other recreation management questions, like the visitor experience scale, or, you know, how was your experience at this one lake, or how was your experience in this 1 mile of trail? You know, certain wildlife species or ecological processes are occurring at broader scales, right? Like the way a black bear experiences a park or protected area is way different from the scale that like a human does. And so the cell phone data can be really nice to get like an entire protected area's worth of some data on visitors, where that can be really hard to do with GPS tracking or counters. You know, in our field, we have these automatic counters that can use mountain biking ones sometimes sense metal, or you can sense infrared or break a beam that just basically automatically count people. It's just a count of people. That can be helpful for understanding visitor use, but the cell phone data often covers an entire protected area and like all the trail systems. And there are some questions on representation and making sure you're calibrating it to make sure you're measuring what you think you measure. But it can be really useful in some of these ecological studies, which was the motivation for Orange County, as we wanted to start to test it out because they had some really important ecological questions at the scale of like the whole county and like many protected areas. And so how do we get that information with limited staff time and limited on the ground resources? So so there's some potential there, but I do think like for the right question, it can be really helpful, but there can be other ways to get at similar information around visitor use with different approaches, just depending upon what your research question is.
Yeah, and you're spot on about the cell phone data. It is very good practice to calibrate it, double check it, make sure it's getting the counts. The counts make sense. And so one of the things that we have done is we'll place out maybe a dozen infrared trail counters. And an infrared trail counter has a unit box on it and a cable, and it has a scope that beams out an infrared light and an infrared laser, infrared beam. And the infrared beam, when someone passes by, it registers that kind of heat, body heat, and says, okay, that's a count of 1, that's a count of 2. And so, and this story is pretty wild that I'm getting into, but it's about infrared trail counters out in the Los Padres area. So we, as I mentioned, with this California project across those 4 national forests in California, we're going to use cell phone data to understand visitation dynamics. And it's at that broad level that you were mentioning, you know, with overlaying it with wildfire potential. And so we put out a lot of infrared trail counters. And one night I was driving home from work after a day at Kansas State University, and I got 5 sequential back-to-back calls from, and on my phone, it was just saying no caller ID, and then again, no caller ID, and then again, no caller ID, and again, no caller ID. And on the infrared trail counters on the unit, I always put a card there that says, hey, this is for research. This is not a camera. If there's any issues, you know, feel free to email or call me. And so it turned out there was an issue. And so somehow the infrared trail counter, this one was buried in the ground, and then we had the scope kind of pushing through some rocks, but like it's kind of back in there, you know, you always try to hide it best. And it got dug up somehow. Then someone else saw the unit and thought it was a bomb, and they called in a bomb scare. Yeah. And so that 5 sequential phone calls from no caller ID was from the sheriff's department, and being like, Brian Peterson, what'd you put on the trail out here?
Oh, no.
And I felt really embarrassed, but it does give a laugh. Right? I was like, oh my gosh, I feel so bad because like the amount of resources that had to get out there, that's a serious thing, right? So, I mean, like the bomb squad's out there, the fire department's out there, you know, sheriff, police. And I guess eventually someone came in and poked it. They were, it's a bomb scare is a bomb scare. You take that very serious. Yeah. But eventually someone came in and poked it, and they're like, this isn't a bomb. And they eventually realized, oh, it's just a measly trail counter. It's not even a video camera or a bomb, luckily. Yeah. So that was wild.
That's quite the story. I have not had that yet with my trail counters. I've definitely had them tampered with, and like I've only had a couple stolen, but never had the bomb squad called on one of my trail counters. That's a good story to have for research.
Yeah, well, hopefully it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. Hopefully, I similarly put little signs on that are like, this is not a camera. Like, this is just for research. All it does is count you. So, yeah, those can be really important for communicating. But still, they do look a little funky, the box on those trail counters.
Yeah, because the ones that I buy, and we probably buy the same one, the Traffics ones, they have that kind of camouflage look to it, and they can look a little funky for sure.
Yeah.
So at the conference, IASNR conference is what we call it. What does that acronym stand for? I totally forget. International
Society for, no, what is it? That's a good question. I should know. I'm like an editor for their journal.
Well, we have so many acronyms, so I feel bad now. I'm making us sound like pretty funny scientists.
It's something and natural resources. I know the ANR part. It's just, is it Society of Natural? You got it. Okay.
International Association for Society and Natural Resources.
There we go.
So this conference is a big one in our field, and it's in Portland, Maine, in mid or early June, and it's going to be a really exciting one. A lot of great scientists are going there, and so I think earlier you described your biggest research that you're going to be presenting there, but you got 2 other presentations there. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have 2 other presentations. Those 2 are projects that are being led by 2 of my graduate students. So one of my PhD students, Susie Sitter, who actually just started a job with the Park Service. So she's almost done
congrats.
her PhD. She's like a couple months away from defending. But one of her dissertation chapters looked at backcountry camping in Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. And in Glacier Bay National Park, one of the most popular recreational activities is backcountry, like kayaking. So you kayak out, you find a beach to camp on, you set up camp, you do these multi-day backpacking kayak trips. And so this was a collaborative project with Utah State University and Dr. Chris Mons, who was my PhD advisor. This was a project that had kind of got started right as I finished my PhD, and then kind of came with me as a collaboration to Oregon State when I started here. And Susie and Chris and our collaborative project, we gave GPS units to kayakers, and we connected them. Folks at Utah State figured this out, not me. I'm not super tech savvy with soldering stuff, but they soldered extra batteries into it so that it could have multi-night tracks, so it could run for many days. So we kind of had, and this was nicer because with kayaking, we could have this extra battery pack. Having the little extra weight was not a big deal compared to a backpacking trip where you're carrying everything on your back. So we gave sea kayakers this GPS unit with extra battery pack connected in, and we were able to get tracks of their trips, their multi-day trips through Glacier Bay. So what Susie is interested in is trying to understand what social and ecological factors on the landscape inform camping decisions. So, what about the beach? Is it that there's not a lot of grasses, that there's open bare ground, that you have a cool view of the glacier? What about that ecological and setting characteristics is influencing where people camp? Because in Glacier Bay, you can camp anywhere, basically anywhere there's a beach. And then socially, is there other factors like the number of other campsites that are nearby? So this is what she's really interested in, is what is driving those decisions that visitors are making in space, particularly relating to camping. Because if we understand and can predict where people might camp, then we can help inform management. We can help monitor those campsites. We can help understand if campsites are too close to areas that might be sensitive for wildlife. So again, trying to predict visitor behavior can help managers best use their resources, and also, again, help inform future monitoring or other studies. So anyway, it's a really long way to explain that. Susie used some really cool techniques from wildlife science, these habitat selection models that wildlife science has developed to figure out how wildlife decide what habitat to use, and she applied it to people. So we have these maps that we created using habitat selection functions, is the jargony term for it, to use different environmental factors that we can pull from GIS, vegetation, elevation, distance to glacier, and predicted where people were going to be camping. So, and that paper, the currency, if you will, in science is, published literature. We publish these papers, our peers review them and say, you did a good job. And then it's published and out there. So Susie's chapter is in review right now. We're waiting. I think we maybe just got feedback on that. So we're hopefully going to have that published very soon. But yeah, so borrowing from wildlife science to understand people is the theme of that one.
Yeah, that's a great use of scientific literature and looking at different approaches and how we can use them to understand people. And I mean, that is a classic issue that we face with GPS, with passing out GPS data loggers to visitors to see where they go. Yes, it's great to see where visitors go, know when they get there, what campsites they use. But when they do multi-night trips, how do you get the batteries to last? So that's great that they overcame it. So they are tech savvy. I'm more like you, Ashley, where I wouldn't be the person coming up with that.
Yeah, in my head, I was like, I'm sure we can do this. I just don't know how to do it. So yeah, some very savvy folks at Utah State were able to figure out a way to like somehow solder in an extra battery pack onto the GPS units that we were using for our study. So they sorted that problem out.
Excellent. Yeah. That's great. So did your PhD student, Susie, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So did Susie go to Glacier Bay, pass out the GPS data loggers, and then got the rest of the data remotely using GIS information?
Yes,
okay.
That's exactly it. So one of the things we're really trying to do in my lab is to make the most of data that's already available. So that the National Park Foundation project that I talked about had no field work. We only used existing data that the parks already had so that other parks could use it, that habitat fragmentation study. In Susie's study, we did go out and collect the GPS tracks. So Susie and students from Utah State went up to Glacier Bay, handed out the GPS units, did some visitor surveys as part of the broader study. And then, so we had that data. And then all the other data, the environmental data, the vegetation, the bare ground for the beaches, the distance to glaciers, all of that data came from just existing data sets that we were able to get in GIS or get from our Glacier Bay National Park partners. So yeah, a lot of students in my lab were trying to leverage existing data as much as we can and data sets that are already out there, again, so that potentially these methods can be maybe more easily replicated by our park partners. I feel like I'm like putting myself out of business as a researcher where I'm like, I'm going to do this and use all the existing data and then give you the way to do it yourself. But it really helps out the park. So that was part of it too, is like, what existing data do we have? And if you have these GPS tracks, which more and more studies have, what are some additional things that you can do without having to go out and collect, do your own veg surveys in Glacier Bay? Not that that wouldn't be fun, but use as much existing resources as we can.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And there's so much data out there. And, with the advent of self-driving cars coming up here, I feel like we're going to be buying vehicle data soon. And then who knows if we're close to, and I feel like we are. I know there's been a lot of work on it, but I feel like we're pretty close to satellite connectivity, which means that's going to also open up our field of research a little bit more too, just for further understanding people's experiences in very remote locations. Mm-hmm. Going back to Glacier, one of the things that I've never been there and I really don't know much about it. How busy is it? Is there a lot of kayakers? Can you access these places on foot? Are there boats that are in the area? And then how much wildlife is there? I mean, there's got to be a ton.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the convenient things from a research standpoint in terms of Glacier Bay National Park is it's pretty remote. It's hard to get to the town of Gustavos, and all the visitors kind of come in through the same place if they're kind of heading out on these like backpacking, kayaking trips. So we were able to like get a lot of the visitors that were there when we were doing this study, which was the summer, I believe, of like 2018. I may be wrong, somewhere around there, before pandemic, definitely before 2020. And Susie started, I believe, in 2018. So we were able to survey a lot of those. The other types of visitor use that comes in is actually via cruise ships. And so one of the data layers, and this was something that a student at Utah State really looked at, was view shed from cruise ships. So you're out there kayaking in this like amazing Alaska National Park, and then like a cruise ship comes through. And so does that, what was the influence of that? How often can those backcountry kayakers like see those cruise ships? So we did have a data layer that was like the cruise ship path and kind of like how much we thought the cruise ship could be viewed from some of those campsites that Susie was interested in. There's also what's called day boat tours. So you can go to Glacier Bay, and if you're not, you don't want to go kayak yourself out into the area, you can get on a day boat with an interpretive ranger, and they'll do kind of a tour and show you some of the glaciers and do some visitor interpretation. So Susie and the students at Utah State also did some surveys on the day boats to get some information about visitor use. So So Susie's one question around predicting camping was part of a larger study of understanding visitor experiences in Glacier Bay. And you also asked me about wildlife. So
Yeah.
I don't have it pulled up right now, but there is a student there from a different university the same summer that our study was being done, looking at visitor impacts and wildlife. And the paper literally just came out like a week ago. I haven't read it yet.
Oh, cool.
But there is a recent study out of Glacier Bay looking at the interaction between visitors and some of the wildlife species that were of concern for park management. So there is some work going on there at that interface of wildlife impacts and recreation use.
Wow, what a cool location for research. Again,
Yeah.
I love our field of research.
Yeah, I
It's
didn't
the
even get
best.
to go on that one though. I got to see all the beautiful pictures, but no, it's okay. I'm glad Susie and students from Utah State got to go. But it's so funny. I've been to Alaska and I've worked on a lot of research projects that have taken place in Alaska, but I have yet to go to Alaska for a research project. So,
Oh gosh,
it's okay. I
That's
shouldn't
wild.
complain. It's like not really a thing to complain about. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, well, I feel like all of us as researchers are like, I want to get that project in Alaska and go up there for a week or two. And gosh. Well, I did have one more question about Glacier. And I don't know, you haven't been there, but how many in Glacier Bay, how many glaciers are visible? And
That's a good question. I don't know. I should know. I know Susie put it in her paper, but I don't know off the top of my head. But that is like
Okay.
a main draw for visitors. And like from her model, like having view of a glacier was something that was semi-important. Like visitors expressed it was important, and it was one of the factors in her model that in some of the models came out as being important. So it is a draw, and you can't like camp right on top of the glaciers, but again, camping somewhere where you wake up in the morning and you can see that glacier is something that is an important factor for visitors. So
yeah, I'd love that without a doubt.
I think you need to plan a trip there now. You can go and you can count all the glaciers and then report back to me since I don't remember.
Yeah, I will replicate your research and use all those same GIS layers, and there you go. Got a little research plan.
You can be our validation data set. We can see where you
There you
camped.
go. I love that. That's perfect. Yeah, I love it. All right, so that's two of your presentations at IASNR, the International Association for Society of Natural Resources Conference. And so what's the last one that you got going there?
Yeah, so I have a brand new PhD student. Her name's Kira Meinhardt, and Kira is interested in understanding the interface between outdoor recreation and climate change impacts. So Kira, that's her theme for her dissertation, and Kira will be presenting one of her first bits of her dissertation research. This is a project in Orange County, California, that we've been working on for a while with Utah State University. And one of the things our park partners really want is kind of a model that helps us understand how susceptible some of these ecosystems are to recreation and climate change that are kind of occurring at the same time. So, right, we're seeing impacts of climate change in our ecosystems, and then we also have recreation on top of that, which can be another form of disturbance. So Kira's work will be looking at where are sensitive wildlife, where are places where we might see more impact from climate change, where is sensitive vegetation, and then how's the recreation overlaying, and creating essentially a map for our partners in Orange County to, again, think about where they might want to do further monitoring, where recreation might be more of a concern compared to other areas, and really creating a tool for managers to help inform future management as we continue to see implications from climate change. So your study looking at fire modeling, we're going to try and incorporate some of that into there, like what places might be more susceptible to fires and how does recreation overlay with that. So it is very much like a classic GIS, a little more sophisticated, but we're overlaying a bunch of stuff and trying to see where certain things align, where we might want to do some more studies in the future, or where managers may want to look a little closer. So that'll be Kira's data. And she'll be we have some streetlight data, but she's going to try using Strava heat maps for that. That's the goal.
Okay.
So yeah, because we can distinguish activity type. So mountain biking and hiking might cause slightly different types of disturbances in recreation systems. So Strava global heat map gives us that activity type that we can't necessarily get from cell phone data. But
yeah, and that's a very accessible data type too, which is nice. Yes. You mentioned streetlight again, and so with the fire modeling project that I'm doing, I ended up buying data from Spectus. Actually, have you heard of that company?
I have not. No.
Yeah, so it's as I mentioned earlier, and as you're aware, purchasing mobile phone data, cell phone data is expensive, and I it's in my budget. It's budgeted for. We have the money. And then I go to K-State and I'm like, hey, I need to make this very large purchase. And they're like, okay, see you in 3 months. And so I don't know if it works the same at Oregon State, but talking to other colleagues, they're like, yeah, that's how it works at my university as well. And so I put in the green light to make the purchase at the in early October, and the purchase has not come through yet. But Spectus data, they'll give me an onboarding, just like, with Streetlight, so you understand how to use their interface, their dashboard and whatnot. But I guess a difference with it is with Spectus, you can do a lot of analysis, Python-based analysis. And so you can come there and script your own. And I know the very basics in Python. I don't feel confident using Python, but my current PhD student has been doing a lot with Python. He's been taking a lot of machine learning and doing all kinds of advanced stuff using Python. He's also been helping me design a unique GIS toolbox for the National Park Service. So he's really great at Python. And so he's going to be the one that's going to be helping me analyze this mobile phone data for the 4 national forests in California. And so I thought it'd be kind of cool to do the Spectus route where he can use some of that Python scripting and whatnot. And that really helps support his career trajectory as well, because he's looking to have a career trajectory more as a data analyst, maybe as a data scientist. But he's not looking to go into academia. He just wants to really he's really fantastic with statistics and really fantastic with Python. He's really fantastic with R. And so he's been just a great, fantastic grad student to work with. Really fun. Good.
Oh, that's always wonderful.
Yeah. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for joining today. And I'm really excited to see you at the IASNR conference in Portland, Maine. And that's another wonderful thing that I do love and miss. That will be my first conference back in person. And so I really, really enjoy our conferences, seeing our colleagues, getting to go have an informal meal and hear what we're all up to. So I'm really excited for that conference, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there. And thanks again for sharing all that great stuff about your research and how helpful it is for the National Park Service and these national forests. And one of the things that was maybe a topic that flowed through our discussion today was helping managers allocate their resources. And one of the things that managers of these parks and protected areas, they don't have a ton of time, they don't have a ton of money. It always helps a lot if they have some sort of targeted area that they need to be monitoring and checking to make sure that it is staying good and pristine for future generations to enjoy just as much as us. So it's really useful for managers to know where to go and when to go to monitor these places. So, well, I wanted to also finalize this episode with giving one more shout out to the George Wright Society. For those of you out there, please check out the George Wright Society at georgewrightsociety.org. It's a nonprofit board. I'm actually just left the board. I'm technically leaving the board on December 31st, but I had been serving on the board since 2017, and it's been a fantastic journey. I love the George Wright Society a lot. I love giving back to the George Wright Society. I love their mission. So if you have an extra second today, be sure to check out the George Wright Society. Okay, Ashley, I'm going to throw on some outro music. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.